Why is it so hard to say no? Not to strangers. Not to people you barely know. But to the people closest to you. Your family. Your friends. Your partner. Your colleague. Someone asks you for something, and even though every part of you wants to say no, even though you are exhausted, overwhelmed, and have nothing left to give, you hear yourself saying yes. And then you spend the next hour, the next day, sometimes the next week resenting it. Resenting them. Resenting yourself. This is not a personality flaw. This is not weakness. This is a deeply rooted psychological pattern that was built into you long before you were old enough to understand what was happening. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why you cannot say no, and you will finally have the tools to change it. The inability to say no almost never starts in adulthood. It starts in childhood, in the environment where you first learned what love looks like, what safety feels like, and what you needed to do to keep both. For many people who struggle with saying no, there was a very specific lesson learned early in life. The lesson that their needs, their comfort, and their preferences were secondary to the needs of the people around them. Maybe you grew up in a household where keeping the peace was survival, where expressing a need or a boundary was met with anger, withdrawal, or emotional punishment, where being agreeable was the only reliable way to feel safe and loved. Maybe you were praised relentlessly for being helpful, selfless, and easy, and learned that your value as a person was directly connected to how little trouble you caused. Maybe you watched a parent sacrifice everything for others and absorbed the unspoken message that this is what good people do. Whatever the specific origin, the result is the same. A child who learns that saying yes keeps them safe and saying no puts everything at risk. That child grows up. But the lesson stays. Over time, the inability to say no stops being just a behavior and becomes an identity. You stop thinking of it as something you do and start thinking of it as something you are. A helpful person. A giving person. Someone who shows up for everyone. Someone who never lets people down. And on the surface, this identity feels positive. It feels virtuous. People praise you for it. They rely on you. They call you the dependable one, the generous one, the one who always comes through. But underneath that identity is something much more uncomfortable. A constant low-level anxiety about what happens if you stop. If you say no. If you let someone down. If you put yourself first for once. Because somewhere deep in your subconscious the equation is still running, the one you learned as a child. My value depends on my usefulness. If I stop being useful, I stop being valued. If I stop being valued, I stop being loved. And that fear, the fear of losing love and belonging by simply having needs, is what keeps the yes coming out of your mouth even when everything inside you is screaming no. Most people have heard of the fight or flight response, the survival mechanism that kicks in when we feel threatened. But there is a third response that is far less talked about and far more relevant to people who cannot say no. It is called the fawn response. Fawning is when a person responds to perceived threat not by fighting or fleeing but by appeasing. By becoming agreeable. By making themselves useful, pleasant, and non-threatening in order to neutralize the danger. This response develops most commonly in people who grew up in environments where conflict was genuinely dangerous, where a parent's anger was unpredictable, where emotional safety depended on keeping someone else calm, where the child learned that the fastest way to feel safe was to become whatever the threatening person needed them to be. As an adult, fawning looks like people-pleasing. It looks like automatically agreeing. It looks like going along with things you do not want to do. It looks like feeling physical anxiety at the thought of disappointing someone. And the most important thing to understand about the fawn response is that it is not a choice. It is an automatic survival mechanism running on autopilot, one that kept you safe as a child but is keeping you trapped as an adult. Even when someone who struggles with saying no manages to get the word out, even in those rare moments when they hold their boundary and decline a request, what follows is almost always immediate and overwhelming guilt. And that guilt is not random. It is the enforcement mechanism of the people-pleasing pattern. Guilt is what your mind uses to punish you for stepping outside the role you have assigned yourself. For daring to have a need. For inconveniencing someone by having a limit. The guilt says you are selfish. The guilt says you could have helped and you chose not to. The guilt says, what kind of person are you? And for someone whose entire sense of self-worth is built on being helpful and available, that guilt is genuinely unbearable. So they give in. They call back and say, actually yes, I can help. They over-explain, over-apologize, overcompensate just to make the guilt stop. And every time they do, the pattern gets reinforced. The mind learns, saying no leads to unbearable guilt. Saying yes makes the guilt stop. So next time, saying yes becomes even more automatic. This is how people pleasers get more trapped over time, not less, even when they genuinely want to change. Here is something that people pleasers rarely talk about and often do not even consciously recognize. Underneath all the agreeableness, all the helpfulness, all the endless yes, there is anger. Deep, accumulated, unprocessed anger. It is the anger of someone who has spent years prioritizing everyone else's needs above their own. The anger of someone who gives and gives and gives, and then watches other people take it for granted. The anger of someone who says yes when they mean no and then has to live with the resentment of having betrayed themselves again. This anger almost never gets expressed directly because expressing anger would mean conflict, and conflict is exactly what the people pleaser has spent their whole life trying to avoid. So instead it comes out sideways. In passive aggression. In sudden emotional explosions over small things that seem disproportionate. In a growing bitterness toward the very people they keep saying yes to. In a slow, quiet withdrawal from relationships that once felt meaningful. The people pleaser does not see themselves as an angry person. But the anger is there buried under all those yeses, building pressure with every boundary that goes unexpressed, waiting for somewhere to go. People-pleasing is exhausting in a way that is very difficult to explain to someone who has never experienced it. It is not just the practical exhaustion of doing too much for too many people, though that is real and significant. It is the psychological exhaustion of constantly monitoring other people's emotional states. Of reading every room you walk into and adjusting yourself accordingly. Of editing every word before it comes out of your mouth to make sure it will not upset, offend, or disappoint anyone. Of being permanently on alert for signs that someone is unhappy and immediately scanning for what you did wrong and how you can fix it. This hypervigilance is relentless. It does not switch off. It follows people pleasers into every interaction, every relationship, every environment. And it consumes enormous mental and emotional energy that is not available for the person's own life, their own goals, their own healing, their own joy. The exhaustion that people pleasers feel is not laziness. It is the result of running a full-time emotional monitoring system for every person in their lives, a system that was never designed to run this hard, for this long, without anyone monitoring them in return. The inability to say no has a profound and often devastating effect on relationships. And not in the way most people expect. You might assume that always saying yes would make you well loved, deeply valued, and surrounded by strong relationships. The reality is almost the opposite. When you never say no, people stop seeing you as a full human being with your own inner life. They start seeing you as a resource. Someone to call when they need something. Someone who will always be available, always be helpful, always come through. They may genuinely like you. They may even genuinely care about you. But they stop considering your limits because you have never shown them you have any. And the relationships that people pleasers tend to attract most powerfully are the ones with people who have no problem taking. People who are comfortable receiving without reciprocating. People who mistake kindness for availability and availability for unlimited supply. The people pleaser gives more and more, hoping that eventually the relationship will become equal. But it rarely does. Because you cannot create equality in a relationship by sacrificing yourself more completely. You create it by being honest about what you need even when that feels terrifying. Every yes that should have been a no has a cost. And people pleasers pay that cost in ways that accumulate quietly over years until the bill becomes impossible to ignore. They pay it in chronic stress, the body holding the tension of constant overcommitment and emotional suppression. They pay it in anxiety, the permanent low-level dread of dropping one of the 100 balls they are keeping in the air for other people. They pay it in lost time, hours, days, years spent on other people's priorities while their own dreams, goals, and needs sit waiting. They pay it in lost identity because when you spend long enough being whatever everyone else needs you to be, you can genuinely lose track of who you actually are underneath all of it. What do you want? What do you enjoy? What are your actual opinions, not the ones calibrated to keep everyone comfortable? For many chronic people pleasers, these questions feel genuinely difficult to answer. Not because the answers do not exist, but because they have been buried under so many years of performing for other people that they have become strangers to themselves. And that estrangement from your own desires, your own voice, your own life is perhaps the heaviest cost of all. Most advice about people pleasing sounds something like this: just start saying no. Set boundaries. Put yourself first. And while this advice is technically correct, it completely ignores the psychological reality of what saying no feels like for someone whose entire nervous system has been trained to treat it as dangerous. For a people pleaser, saying no does not just feel uncomfortable. It feels like a genuine threat. Like something terrible is about to happen. Like the relationship will end, the person will be furious, they will be abandoned, they will be seen as selfish and uncaring. These feelings are not rational. But they are real. And they are powerful enough to override conscious intention every single time. This is why people pleasers can read every self-help book, attend every therapy session, genuinely want to change with everything they have, and still find themselves saying yes again and again. Because the pattern does not live in the rational mind where logic and intention operate. It lives in the nervous system, in the subconscious, in the body. And changing it requires working at that level, not just deciding to be different, but slowly, carefully, consistently teaching your nervous system that saying no is safe. Changing the people-pleasing pattern is not about becoming selfish. It is not about suddenly refusing everyone everything. It is about slowly, carefully building a new relationship with your own needs, one where they are allowed to exist, allowed to be expressed, and allowed to matter. The first step is building awareness, learning to notice the moment before the automatic yes. That split second where you feel the request land and your body begins its familiar compliance response. In that moment, instead of immediately responding, practice pausing. You do not have to have the answer instantly. It is completely acceptable to say, "Let me think about that and get back to you." That pause is where your authentic response lives. The second step is starting small. You do not begin with the hardest no of your life. You begin with the lowest stakes situation you can find and practice declining something genuinely minor. Each small no that does not end in catastrophe teaches your nervous system a little more that the boundary is survivable. The third step is sitting with the guilt without acting on it. When the guilt comes, and it will come, you allow yourself to feel it without immediately reaching for the yes to make it stop. You remind yourself that guilt after a healthy boundary is not evidence that you did something wrong. It is evidence that you did something new. You are not too sensitive. You are not selfish for wanting to say no sometimes. You are not a bad person for being exhausted by giving everything to everyone while quietly running on empty. You are someone who learned very early that your safety depended on your agreeableness. And that lesson, however necessary it once was, is no longer serving you. You are allowed to have limits. You are allowed to have needs. You are allowed to be a full human being whose comfort matters, not just to the people around you, but to yourself. If this video helped you see yourself more clearly, subscribe right now. Every single week we go this deep into the psychology behind why you think, feel, and behave the way you do. Nobody explains it like this anywhere else. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, what is the hardest situation for you to say no in? I read every single comment and your answer might help someone else feel less alone. And if you want to go even deeper, next week we are covering something that will change how you see every relationship in your life. The dark psychology of guilt tripping, how it works, who uses it, and why you fall for it every single time. That video is coming next and you do not want to miss it. See you there.